I'm Michelle Smith, and you're listening to Gather Voices, the podcast aimed at helping you discover and create a beautiful, inspired life through community, conversation, and design. You can find more at the Gather Goods Co. online shop at gathergoodsco.com, and if you're in the Raleigh, North Carolina area, you can visit in person at our shared studios, showroom, and classroom space. Just let me know ahead of time so that I can make sure that I'm there. And if you like this podcast, please tell your friends, leave a review, and subscribe. It really helps get the word out, and it helps others to find us. This conversation is between myself and flower farmer Tracy Huntley. She has been a flower farmer for the past 20 years. She has a small home-based flower farming business. And this past year and the past couple of years have been especially challenging for her. You know, we've all been grappling with the pandemic, but Tracy in particular has gone through even more grief. Her husband was battling cancer for 2 years, and he passed away recently. And her mother also has dementia. So she's been having to grapple with all of that alongside her business and what that looks like. So we talk about farming and flower farming on a small scale, but we also talk about working through the garden and through our grief. Tracy talks about how her faith has gotten her through it, but ultimately we both talk about, you know, the power of spring and renewal and seasons, and how, how inspiring it is to have the birds chirping and spring always consistently coming back. So I hope you enjoy listening to this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it.
I'm Tracy Huntley. My little business is Springwell Gardens. I do this in my backyard. Grow flowers. Have been growing them for probably about 20 years. In my backyard, I did weddings for a while, and most recently I was growing to sell to floral designers. I am also a widow, a grandmother, and a daughter, and a sister.
I know that plays a big part in who you are. You seem to bring all those pieces to the puzzle. It doesn't seem like one is maybe more important than the other. Maybe being a family person is more important than everything else, right?
Yes, I would say the family comes first here.
You have been, like you said, gardening in your backyard, and you have been doing it commercially in your backyard. That's something that I've found really interesting about what you do. You know, you live here in downtown Cary, and you used to rent a plot elsewhere, but you also have done a significant portion of what you do in your backyard. So how do you do that, and how has it evolved over the past, 15 or so years of you creating this business?
I would say the first time I realized I could grow flowers was probably in the early 90s when I found a book in the library called The Flower Farmer. I thought, oh my goodness, those zinnias I tried to go 20 years ago, I can try again. And I did, and it worked. So I would say that started the love of gardening. And when we moved to this house in 1997, I wanted to have a little plot where I could grow. And that's all I did, was just grow for myself for a very long time. And then I started doing flowers for church. So there'd be weekend arrangements that I did. And that kind of morphed and evolved, and the gardens got bigger. And my husband was always willing to go out there and dig another bed and dig another bed and dig another bed. And pretty soon the backyard was full of raised beds. I ended up with 24, and now I'm cutting back.
Gardening is such a hands-on process, and I am a very tactile learner. So I can read, all the books in the world. Like, I've read that book as well, and many others, but I have to actually learn by doing and actually trying things myself. I worked in a greenhouse for 3 years, and that helped me get a real sense of, it still didn't help me in terms of flower farming, but it did give me a sense of, the real work and the effort and the intention that goes behind creating something like this. I mean, most of it is not glamorous work. I mean, you have to be watering your plants all the time, and you have to be weeding, and you have to be planting them on a very specific schedule. I grew up in Northern Virginia, and in the country, there was a pick your own flower farm, and they lived on this like sprawling land out in the country in this like stone farmhouse, and people would make appointments to come to their yard and pick flowers for their weddings, etc. I grew up always making bouquets in my yards. I still do that like every week just from the flowers that I grow. But what you have done, it's hard to quantify to people just how much labor and love has had to go into that, because again, I have a bunch of raised beds in my yard and I keep adding more and more, but the idea of scaling that to actually doing it on a commercial level, which I know, again, you say you do it on a smaller commercial level, that's quite a job. But obviously you can't do it if you don't love it, right?
That's right. That's right. You've got to enjoy getting your hands in the dirt. It was really neat when I got the plot and was able to do that for a few years, because at the plot, it was almost a quarter of an acre that I was growing on. Keith Ramsey with Garden Supply Company let me use a little bit of land and grow out there. And we had no equipment. He had a beat up tractor, and occasionally Wilson would go out there and plow. But most of the beds I dug, they were 4 by 20-foot beds. I dug with a shovel and a mattock, and I ended up out there with about 24 beds.
Wow. So good exercise, right?
It was great exercise. It was pretty weedy too. I could not keep the weeds down, but I was able to grow a lot of flowers out there.
I love going to botanical gardens and just any garden, just looking at them. I loved picking up flowers from you a few years ago and just like sneaking around in your backyard and seeing how lovely it was. But I especially love when you go to these botanical gardens who have like, dozens of staff members and they're like immaculate. But I've never seen a working garden that looks like that, because you just can't look, the weeds are just out of control here, especially I think because it gets so hot. I was looking at some pictures from my garden from last year, and I'm getting better at taking notes. I know that that's like a really important thing, and I'm getting so much better at that. But like I was reviewing just pictures from the year, and I was looking at all the pictures that I took at the garden. And it's always interesting to see on a month by month and a week by week basis what changes. But I was looking at like October, and the whole garden was just wild and crazy, and there's weeds all in the paths. And I guess I could try to do some steps to prevent it. I always do. I put down mulch, wood chips and all this kind of stuff, but it's just inevitable. Aiming for perfection, you may not find that.
Exactly. You probably won't, unless you want to spend 24 hours a day out in the garden, which I don't think most people can. When you talk about note taking, I think that is one of the key things that you can do yourself, because you talk about being a tactile learner, a hands-on learner. The notes and the pictures kind of also aid that process a lot, because you can look at your notes and go, "Ooh, I remember that now, and I don't want to do that again."
Yeah, it's so easy to forget too what happened a year ago.
Oh,
and
yes.
before that. And the thing that I always think that's interesting about gardening is sticking to the calendar date of like, okay, it's 6 to 8 weeks out and it's this day and you have to like plant these things. And if you miss this window, I know that you like to plant things early. Like there's a whole movement that's been growing, especially in the past, few years, about cold season flowers. And I know that that's something that you do, and that you also are starting your seeds like extra early. So do you have any thoughts on why that is effective, or how to do that for the person who's trying to do this at home?
For the home gardener, I would love to highly recommend a book if you're interested in growing flowers in the cool season. And we live in a zone that's very conducive to that. And it's by Lisa Mason Ziegler, and it's Cool Flowers. And I pull it out every year, and I've probably had this book for about 7 years, but I refer to it every year starting in August. But home gardeners can do a lot of what she talks about in here, because you don't need grow lights to do what she's telling you to do. You need to start your seeds in late summer, and you put them in the ground, and you do offer some protection with maybe frost cloth, and that's about all you do, and you wait. Now, the other thing I'm doing, and this is just for fun, I think if I were a commercial gardener and I needed all this space for growing commercial, I don't know that because I'm so small, I don't know that I would donate shelves in my grow room to warm season flowers now, but I am. Yeah. I'm doing just a handful. I'm doing zinnias and celosia and cosmos. And number one, I'm trying to see, can you grow them starting in January, and keep them healthy until you can get them outside, which will be later this month. And it's an experiment.
When I worked at the greenhouse, I got a bunch of free seeds. Now, obviously, it's been a few years, so seeds, their germination rates go down, of course. But I've been, like you said, experimenting for a really long time with plants outside with seeds, and it's so magical, right? To be able to it's just every single time I check on my little plant babies all the time, every day, because it's just miraculous. It's just always inspiring. Do you have any plants that you love in this particular zone, which is, I guess, zone B, 7B? But then, of course, there's microclimates. Microclimates are pockets of areas in every person's yard that either are a little bit less than that or a little bit more than that. You kind of have to watch your yard over time to figure out what those are. But do you have any favorite flowers that you always grow that are easy and look beautiful in bouquets in your house, but also just, you don't have to manage them as much as some other flowers?
Zinnias. I had zinnias in my wedding flowers, so they've always been special to me, and it was the one I've always wanted to grow.
Do you have a particular watering technique? Do you use drip irrigation, or do you water, by hand, or do you use a combination of things?
I do hand waterings. This year I may invest in a small irrigation system for my beds. But with hand watering, I can see where I'm watering and make sure I'm not having runoff or anything like that. So it's a watering one, and I allow, an hour or so twice a week to do it.
So you go out in the morning, I assume, when it's
Yes.
Hasn't gotten hot. You can't, in the August, heck, by June, it's super hot here. So
Yeah.
You're out there watering. That's the way it was in the greenhouse. I had to water everything. That was one of my jobs. And the greenhouse is, 10 to 15 degrees warmer than it is outside. So, it was 110, 115 degrees. It was crazy hot in there. We had to water all the time. We had to water, every couple hours because it would get so hot in there. And the plants were inside little tiny cells instead of, in the ground. Obviously, if plants are in the ground, then they can get more of that natural moisture that comes from the ground. You don't have to water them as much. The thing about annuals is obviously they have shallower roots, so they need to be watered a lot more often. When you grow perennials are plants, and I'm just saying this obviously for people listening, but perennials are plants that you have to, that come back every year, but they only bloom for a short window of time, so only a few weeks. And then annuals, of course, you plant them every year, and those are the ones that make great cut flowers because they bloom from spring until fall, but their root system is a lot shallower because it hasn't had time to develop, so you have to water them more often. So it's kind of a toss-up, right, between the lower maintenance perennials or the full season, bloom, for sure.
That's right.
Do you have any perennials that you love?
Yarrows are some of my favorite perennials. Hellebore. I love hellebore because they come up so early in the season. And I would say for the fall, the Caryopteris and beautyberry but I do grow a variety of perennials too. So, and sedum. Sedum when you talk about perennials in a short flower span, they have a long season because they'll start up green in August, and you can keep those flowers going all the way through October.
And the bees love them. I have some autumn glow sedum, and the bees the pollinators are just totally attracted to those. So yeah, that one is a good one. And I like how you can propagate them super easily. If
yes,
you can just break off a piece and then stick it in soil and it becomes a new plant, which is amazing, which you can't do with all plants.
Those are great for that.
Yeah. They are. So you said you had 24 beds over at the garden supply company. How many beds would you say you have in your backyard? I know it's different because you have different sized beds.
About 20 beds, but I'm getting ready to turn some of those beds back into border areas. So I'm going to take down the edgings on the bed, and they're going to become less intensive. I'm just going to kind of probably turn those over to more low maintenance shrubs and perennials.
That brings up, obviously you've had an incredibly hard few years, but your husband recently passed away. He was a significant help in your garden. He was probably, it's your business, but he was as much a part of it as you were. How do you think that his passing is going to affect how you proceed with it. Obviously, it sounds like you're downsizing because you probably can't do so much. And also, I know that that must be challenging in terms of just reimagining the business.
It is. I'm in the process of getting my bearings. The whole time Wilson was sick while I was running my business for 2 years. Last year, I really took a break. I just let everything go and did not do any selling because my focus was on him. I knew our time was limited. And now that I'm going back into production without him, as you said, I am kind of bringing everything down. I'm shrinking my borders. So that I can manage what I need to do. And I do. I miss them every day. I get out there and I go, oh, Wilson made this. Oh, Wilson did that. And, it's definitely a bittersweet thing.
Obviously, when you have been married to somebody for so long, your whole life is so entwined. I've certainly been through people passing and seen, lots of people that I love having passed. And I think the effects of having a spouse pass, which obviously I've only seen through other people, I haven't obviously dealt with that myself, but you become so entwined with this person, and it really must be so hard to go about your life. Everything that they've touched is something that you've touched, and every piece of it is something that reminds you of them. And obviously, I think that once you get to that place, which it'll probably be a long time, I'm sure, but knowing that the garden was this beautiful tribute as well, it sure will be, it'll be so bittersweet. I'm sure it is right now.
Yes, that's challenging. And you're right. Marriage is an intertwining of two lives. We were husband and wife for 40 years and 8 days. He died a week after our 40th anniversary. When Wilson was in his last weeks, that was where his focus was. His focus was on his faith, and his focus was on his family. And that's what we did for the 7 weeks we had. We had family around us continually. He prepared for his funeral. He talked several times with a dear friend who's also a pastor. And that's what we did to prepare for this. And now that I am in the new stage, that's where I get my comfort. I love being in the garden. I cry in the garden. I miss Wilson in the garden, and I talk to Jesus in the garden.
The garden is really a very contemplative, prayerful place, right? I mean, that's the place where anybody goes. I always say that anybody who has a really large and cultivated garden has probably gone through or going through something significant in their lives, because the garden is really a therapy, right? It's a form of working through your emotions in long form over time. And it's also such like a beautiful poetic analogy of like life itself, right? You really become aware of seasons in a way that nothing else can teach you, right? You watch the process of the seeds growing, and you watch them in their full bloom in the summer, and then in the fall they start to die off, but they're nurturing other birds and that sort of thing. And then the winter is a time of stillness, and it's not as nice, but then every season new growth emerges. So I think that there's actually a book that came out, I haven't read it, but I think it's called The Well Gardened Mind. I can link to it when I find it, but it is a horticulturalist who just wrote that, basically about how gardening is therapy. And there's also a degree of study, which I would love to do this, but I don't see many offerings of this in the United States yet. It's very popular in the UK and places like that, but horticultural therapy, which is just the idea of, nurturing people who have, who are either senior citizens or who have physical disabilities. That's actually one of the reasons why I started working at the greenhouse too. I went through a big burnout phase with Gather. I had worked myself too hard. I was pushing myself in ways that didn't make sense. I was kind of doing things for customers instead of for myself. And I just needed to pause. And so during that pause phase, I was like, what do I want to do? Do I want to open up a flower garden? Do I want to one day do that? And again, I don't usually start things unless I've tried them so many times. So again, maybe 20 years from now, maybe 15 years from now, maybe not at all. But I have to try it. I have to experiment with things first. But being around all of those plants and nurturing them, they nurtured me back, right? All of the energy of the plants, I've become now one of these like
really hippy dippy people who totally understands and believes in every life form and these sentient beings in these plants, which are living organisms, and that all the energy from it really comes back to you. And even if you don't believe in that, just the process of working it works on you. It sounds like that has really helped you and continues to help you, has been going out there in the garden.
It does. It does. Yeah.
So this year in particular, actually these past few years has been extremely heavy for you. So, not only was your husband diagnosed with an illness, and then he had to go through it for so many years. And then of course he passed away and the pandemic is happening, but also your mom has dementia. And so you've had to become a caregiver almost right after or during this process. So, it's like so much heaviness, right? So obviously it sounds like you're leaning on your faith to get you through that. What has it been like having to go through a really heavy season, an unexpectedly heavy season? How have you had to transition, and how are you leaning into that right now?
My mother was showing signs of dementia while Wilson was sick. And I do have a sister that lives within an hour of us. So Juanita was taking on that caretaking role. And the dementia's progressed faster than we thought it would be progressing. But I wasn't involved with it last year. I was very focused on Wilson. So when Wilson passed away, he died in September, and I started spending time with my mom in October. I realized the dementia was progressing faster than Juanita and I thought it was. Because with dementia, you can kind of cloak it. You've got autopilot that you can fall back onto. But if you dig a little bit below that, you see that there are a lot of memory issues going on. And I'll be frank with you, I was pretty upset. And I really was like, I've been a caregiver, an intensive caregiver for 2 years, and now I've got it back on my plate. And I was like, Lord, I can't do this. I cannot. And I will tell you, there have been many, many days of just tears and heartache over the fact that my mom is having to deal with this.
Well, and you are having to deal with it too. I mean, of course, of course, your mother, but also, yeah, like why, right? I mean, you can't help but ask these big questions.
If you'd asked me in December, I was very, very hearted about this. I was like, I can't do this. And I still can. It's not something I go, oh yeah, I have figured this all out. We do have ways of helping us deal with it, but it's a moment by moment, day by day thing with the Lord and with me.
I mean, it'll probably take a lifetime to process, but it'll take many, many, many years for you in the future. It's like all of us need perspective, and you can't have any perspective because you're in this really challenging, heavy place. Something that we touched on earlier was the concept of you feeling, you're not, you run this amazing business. It's super inspiring. But from what I've observed, you also are such a very strongly family-oriented person. I'm sort of that way too, where my family comes first, and the lifestyle that I build for us and them is actually incredibly important to me. I'm a homebody. I also happen to have this business because I'm passionate about it, and I want to, bring this joy and inspiration to other people. But my family, of course, always comes first.
Wilson was the caregiver.
Mm-hmm.
Wilson was the one that could drop everything to take care of his mom. That's why he helped me in the garden. He was a caregiver. It's neat to see how God can take something that I'm very, very weak in, and he says, well, I'm going to teach you how to do it. And
right. Yeah. It's sometimes like the only way past it is through it. I've had to go through a lot of hard circumstances in my life through, whether it was seeing people pass early on and having to be witness to a lot of my grandmother lived with us for a long time. She had multiple cancers, and my grandmother, my great aunt, also had dementia. And just going through those processes, it's hard, right? We've also just had personal things in our own life. It's you can't explain that stuff to other people other than just it's hard. You have to get through it. It's confounding. You don't understand why it's happening. But for me, and I don't know for you, you may not be here at this place yet, but one thing that I have learned is that all of the challenging things that I've had to go through that feel insurmountable are not insurmountable because I'm here, but they've made me more compassionate to other people and the things that they've had to go through. And in a way, they've made me more grateful and more grounded than I was before. It's almost like when you don't have children and then you have children, that light switch turns off, right? You don't know what selfish is until you have kids, and then you're like, oh, I was really selfish before that. And that's not a judgment, it's just like I didn't understand. And so it's almost like when you go through these really debilitating hard things, you suddenly are enlightened to other people's experiences more than you ever were before. And then you're able to appreciate the little things in a way that you weren't before. So I hope that you're able to get there. And I'm sure it sounds like you are probably finding glimmers of that.
Exactly right, Michelle. The School of Hard Knocks is a great place to learn empathy and compassion and sympathy. Because when you get hit with something, you go, oh, I understand. I understand what that person's feeling a little bit better. Or I know how that impacts somebody because you've been through it yourself. And those are the people I prefer to listen to also. So, we were talking about my mom and dementia. Well, I've got a friend whose mother's been dealing with Alzheimer's for 10 years now. So she's a phone call away. And sometimes I don't like her advice at all. It's hard, but I listen to her because she's had that experience and she's walked that path.
I mentioned to you the other day a book that I have read multiple times and that I recommend to a lot of people, and it's called When Things Fall Apart by Pema Chodron. And she's a Buddhist nun, and she became a Buddhist nun in the 70s when she was about 40 years old. She had 2 kids. She's from New Jersey. She's actually the first ordained woman Buddhist nun, and she's been doing it for like 40 or 50 years. And she gives a lot of talks about her perspective. One thing that I really like about the way she talks about hard things is that she marries her past experience that we can relate to, this sort of like woman whose husband left her or who had like really snarky thoughts about people and just was like a very relatable person. But now she marries it with this sort of like very poetic, spiritual, sort of Zen, literally Zen perspective, which is how do we deal with that stuff? So the book has always been a favorite. The title is a little daunting, right? When Things Fall Apart, like you don't necessarily want to read a book like that. But the whole premise of the book is the idea of not running away from the hard things and just sitting with them. And that until we sit with them, we can't actually move past them, that we're just burying them, that we're not really processing it. And I think in life, like, we don't always talk about the hard stuff, right? We always gloss it over with sort of the pretty things. It's the hard stuff that actually leads to the good stuff. I mean, it's not good and easy to be in the hard place, and it takes many, many, many years. Grief is such a long process. It's not fast. We want it to be fast. We want to move on to the next thing, but it's not that way, right? It's like one tiny baby step at a time. I like that quote that's like, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And it's like, that's what grief is. That's what hard things are. You can't magically make it go away. You just have to sit in it and let it evolve and let it sort of do its thing and work through you. And I think the key is, how do you emerge from that not bitter and use it as a learning experience and then have a better and brighter life as a result of it? But you still have to go through it, of course, to get to the other side. So, or is there anything that's bringing any lightness or joy to your days? Or I read that about actually somebody who was a psychologist who was dealing with his wife who had dementia for like 10 years. And he said for him, one of the greatest things that brought him joy was creating rituals and routines and habits. So very consistent things. So like, even if it was watching Wheel of Fortune at 7:00 and going to bed at the same time and having the same breakfast. And that actually concept has been something that I've leaned into a lot as the pandemic has hit, like, reading comforting books, but watching reruns of a show or doing embroidery or things that are, maybe not as spontaneous as they were before, but just those simple rituals have been creating comfort. So is there anything, that's sort of two questions. One is there anything inspiring you right now and bringing you light and joy? And are there any routines or rituals that you're sort of clinging to bring you comfort?
The daily routine I have is to get up first thing in the morning and open my Bible. So I do get joy and delight out of doing that. And I also have a prayer list. So each and every day I've got folks I'm praying for, situations I'm praying for. And that's what I do the first thing in the morning. And I love doing it with a cup of coffee.
Mhm.
So that's definitely a daily ritual, is to have coffee. And one of these days I might wean myself off of coffee and go to tea, but right now the coffee's a comfort.
Yeah, I mean, if it's working, then
Yeah,
just well, if it's
yeah.
not broken, right? Don't fix it.
And I love playing around in the grow room. So I've got a studio, and in the wintertime, I'm always up there checking to see how stuff is doing and seeing, can I put another tray in here or
That's
whatever.
right. That's the fun for me as well, as the experimentation and being able to pour
Exactly.
yourself into something that doesn't really have a set outcome. You're just kind of waiting and seeing and literally giving it to God, right? You're like, this is on you. I will do my part, but I can't guarantee that they won't get a fungal disease or that they will thrive, or it's all just sort of a wild experiment. And yeah, so do
And
you
then take notes and see how it works out next year.
That's right. Exactly. Don't forget how you did what you did. Yeah. Do you have any ways that you take notes? Do you have like a garden journal or anything like that? Or is it just like pieces of paper and
I do. I get these, they're academic calendars. I like the academic because it's more than 12 months. So it starts in July and it goes through the December of the following year. So with the academic calendar, you can make little notations on the calendar part, and then you actually have weekly places where you can put your notes. When things start blooming, I usually have a week a month where I will say blooming now, and I just do a column of whatever's blooming. And I refer back to those next year to the following year to see what was blooming.
I created my garden journal this year, kind of bullet journal style, which is just where you write things down. Because I write things very tangentially. I mean, my notes are literally like, on little scraps of paper, and then
I've got those too.
yeah, and then I put them away after. But I also have a notebook as well. But I started with the bullet journal because the bullet journal, you can write things in whatever order you want, and then you can just write an index, and the index refers to it. But I like the idea of having the already structured calendar. That's a good one.
Well, this one I started with these in 2013. So it's fun to look back.
Yeah, you have a record, right?
I've got a record, and they're enjoyable to look at and see. Oh wow, I was doing that. I forgot all about growing, blah blah blah. So
If you ever need any help with your garden, I know you have a daughter who does this and you have lots of family around you, but I'm always happy to come and get my hands dirty and learn through doing. So, I really love being around flowers and just learning what other people are doing. So if you need help, I'm literally blocks away from you.
this year, as I get my bearings, that's one of the things I would like to do is help people figure out how to do a garden bed. So if they're wanting to do something with cut flowers, teach them how to do that. If they're wanting to do something that's more landscape on a small scale, like maybe a mailbox bed or, a border in the back of the yard. So those are some of the things I'm thinking about doing as I change the yard from productive flower beds back to beds and borders that are just for landscape purposes or just, for personal cut flowers.
Well, let's do it.
I'm ready for spring. I don't know about you, but I am so ready for spring. But you're talking about the hard things in life, and of course, this winter was hard in a lot of ways. But it makes you, when you get stuck inside and it's yucky and gloomy, it makes you appreciate when things get better. It really does.
There's nothing like the green of the plants and the trees right at the beginning of spring. I mean, it's just so green. And I'm like, I tell everybody, or anybody who knows me knows that there's me through fall, fall, spring, and summer. And then like in wintertime, I'm just like hibernating and not my full self. But when I can be surrounded by the greenery and the plants and the growing things, I just feel so invigorated, and seeing the crocuses blooming right now and the daffodils and the robins out, knowing that, and the little seedlings, and knowing, like I said, that change is coming and that you just have to trust the process. I think that's the hardest thing with anything, right? Is just trusting that there are things greater than yourself, that the process is going to happen regardless of whether you want it to or not. And you just kind of have to ride those waves. Yeah, I agree.
So, for those of you that were inspired to start growing your own seeds in the garden from this podcast, I have created a PDF download for those of you that are in the 7B zone, just like myself. So, that would be anybody who is in the central Piedmont, North Carolina area, Raleigh, Durham, that sort of thing. But the best way to know what zone you're in is to do a quick search online. So, just put in last frost date and your zip code, and that will tell you when that is. If you're in the central North Carolina area and you're in zone 7B, which, like I said, that I am, then the average last frost date is going to be somewhere around April 6th to April 10th. But you still have to watch the weather to make sure that it doesn't get, especially cold and have a frost somewhere in between that. For everybody else, like I said, a simple Google search will help you. I have created a free PDF download for those that are in zone 7B. In the Piedmont, Central North Carolina area. And you can access that by going to www.community.gathergoodsco.com/resources.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed what you heard, please tell your friends, subscribe so that you'll know about new content. I'm Michelle Smith, and this is the Gather Voices podcast.